In this video, I'm going to be talking about ideology and party identification. In terms of the learning objectives, after this lecture, you'll be able to distinguish between ideology and party identification. You'll be able to identify three factors that are related to ideology, and you'll be able to describe the ideology of liberals in regards to those three factors. You'll also be able to describe the ideology of conservatives in regards to those three factors. You'll be able to compare and contrast the views of liberals and conservatives on specific policies. Then when we get to political parties, you'll be able to identify and describe the primary and secondary objectives of political parties. You'll also be able to explain how party labels make it easier for citizens to vote. You'll be able to describe the theory of issue ownership and provide examples of issues that each party owns. And then you'll be able to explain something called Duverger's law and its significance to American politics. With that in mind, let's begin with ideology and party identification. The first thing I want to point out is that ideology and party identification are not the same thing. If you fall between the ages of 18 to 25, it's understandable that you might think that party identification and ideology are the same thing. Because right now, in the 2020s, most Democrats identify themselves as liberals, and most Republicans identify themselves as conservatives. But that is a time-dependent situation. That's something that's just happening right now. But for those of you who pay attention to politics, that's all you've ever seen. And so it would make sense that you might think, well, of course, they're always connected. Well, actually, that's not true. And so I want to start off talking a little bit about political parties historically in the United States. But I'm going to tell you ahead of time that I'm not going to test you on the history of political parties in the United States. We're going to focus on the political science part of political parties and ideology, but I do want you to understand this. So historically, the southern states voted for Democrats. This is in part a product of the Civil War, right? The southern states made up the Confederacy, the northern states were the Union. And the clash was between these two groups. So out of this eventually developed the Republican Party, the Party of Lincoln, and the Democratic Party, which was more commonly associated with the South. Around the 1960s, a battle for control of the Democratic Party started. What happened is that there were liberals who were from the North, who were Democrats, that made up part of the Democratic Party, but there were also conservatives from the South who had been historically voted Democratic. And so you had these two groups of people who identified as Democrats, but they had very different views. And in particular, around the 1960s, there was a big clash over two particular policies. One had to do with federal legislation in regards to civil rights. For conservative Democrats in the South, they felt that civil rights was a states' rights issue, that rather than the federal government imposing its views on and policies on the states, each state should be able to decide for itself how to handle certain issues related to civil rights and also voting rights. Democrats from the North, who tended to be more liberal, felt like it was important for the federal government and for Congress to step in and pass laws protecting Black Americans, mostly in the South, because there was a feeling that the Southern Democrats had done things to disenfranchise Blacks. The word disenfranchise is a long word, but it just basically means making it difficult for people to vote. When you grant people the franchise, that's the expression, you're giving them the right to vote. When you disenfranchise somebody, you're taking away their right to vote. And so the Northern liberals wanted the federal government to be active and to pass laws to make it easier for black people to vote. The Southern Democrats felt like they wanted to let each state handle this issue on their own. The other issue that they debated over and disagreed over was over the Civil War. Now, Northern liberals tended to oppose U.S. involvement in Vietnam, and Southern conservatives tended to support America's involvement in Vietnam. During the 1960s, our involvement was growing and growing and growing. Well, in the struggle over control of the Democratic Party, the Northern liberals won. They eventually were able to unseat some very prominent conservative Democrats and take over the chairmanship of the committees. And as a result, the Democratic Party started passing laws, the 1964 Voting Rights Act, 1965 Civil Rights Act, and this caused a lot of disaffection among Southern conservatives who at first sort of voted for an independent party candidate, and then eventually they joined the Republican Party. Now, the Southern conservatives, they hadn't changed their ideology. They hadn't changed the view that they had about the role that the federal government should play. What they changed was their party identification. They were Southern conservatives who identified as Democrats, but after this party realignment, they were still from the South, they were still conservatives, but now the South became essentially the base of the Republican Party. So after the last party realignment that happened in the 1960s, ideology looks like it matches party identification perfectly. And so once again, if you grew up during this time, it's entirely understandable that you might think, well, ideology and party are the same thing. They're not. And just like there has been a party realignments in the past, future realignments are possible as well. We just don't know. And so therefore, when I teach this class, I make a point of telling students to keep ideology here and party identification here separate from one another conceptually, even though right now they look like they're basically the same thing. But from a conceptual perspective, it's important that we treat them as two distinct things. So with that in mind, if you've been wondering through this all, what does Phil mean by a party? What does Phil mean by ideology? I'll begin to explain that in the next video.